is a state? A state is an institution that has sovereignty over some piece of land. But that means we also have to define what it means to be sovereign. The main defining feature of sovereignty is what's called the monopoly of violence. Which sounds a bit scary, because it kinda is. Whoever has the right to use force on a particular piece of land without some greater power being able to intervene has the monopoly of violence over that land. Let's put these ideas into some context so we can understand them more clearly. In Northwest Africa, there's a place called Western Sahara. And if you've ever just sort of stared at the map for a while, you might have noticed it, because it stands out a bit as one of the only places on the map that has a dashed line instead of a solid one. And I say a place rather than a country because its status is the subject of some dispute. Morocco claims Western Sahara as its own territory, and it occupies about 70% of the land, including its largest city, by force. The reason for the divide is historical. Morocco itself was a colony of the French, while Western Sahara, previously known as Spanish Morocco, was, as you might have guessed, a colony of Spain. The current king of Morocco sees this as an artificial line, created by European imperialism, and that's why he claims Western Sahara for himself as just another part of Morocco. But the Sahrawi rebels in Western Sahara, who control the other 30% of the territory and represent Western Sahara's independence movement, reject Moroccan control. They don't care why that line in the sand exists, even if it is for bad reasons, and it clearly is. Because on the other side of that line is an absolute monarch, who does not care what they think about anything, and has been trying for years to repress their efforts at self-determination. So they continue to fight on for their freedom and independence, even as countries like France especially have renewed their push to hand the entirety of Western Sahara over to the King of Morocco. So who has sovereignty in Western Sahara? It's tricky because not everyone says the same thing. Morocco and France say it's all Morocco, while the Sahrawi rebels say it's all Western Sahara, and the rebels have UN support for that claim as well. But it can't really be both, can it? Because if I go to Western Sahara and commit some sort of crime, either the Moroccan regime or the rebels will arrest me. They can't both do it. That means on any given square foot of the country, it's either one or the other. That line might shift over time as fighting between the claimants carries on. There will always be one group with the power to use force anywhere you stand. Which means the answer to our question about sovereignty is those percentages from earlier. The 70% that's occupied by Morocco is effectively Morocco. UN and rebels be damned. And the 30% that Sahrawi run is Western Sahara. King Mohammed and Emmanuel Macron be damned. Power tells you who's in charge, not the UN, not a piece of paper, or anything else. Only the ability to use force or the monopoly of violence tells you who is sovereign. I've managed to sneak a mini episode of The Hastening in here, but this isn't about foreign policy today. This is a show about American cities, and in particular, Los Angeles, California. States within the US have a different relationship to sovereignty than states in the international sense. California does not have sovereignty in any absolute sense. US federal law supersedes state law, meaning California's limited sovereignty is mostly just what falls under the 10th Amendment, which is the amendment reserving all powers not given to the federal government for state governments. How each state manages its affairs within these constraints is up to the people and institutions of that state, and to the local governments within, which share some powers with their state government, including things like law enforcement, and that's the main thing that I want to talk about here. Because I have never seen anyone more unable to grasp where power resides and how it functions than the Democratic Party, who have held nearly one-party rule in California for decades. Their leaders are somehow the most politically illiterate group of politicians on the entire planet, while still managing to be smug and condescending from their position of absolute ignorance. Political power comes from the barrel of a gun. That's what monopoly of violence means. The monopoly of violence is codified in constitutions and books full of laws, but laws and constitutions don't enforce themselves. Guns do. Liberals have chosen to separate law and its enforcement from politics within their own minds, a line which does not and cannot exist in reality. Law is politics, and politics is law. These things are untangleable. And the prize you get for pretending they're separable is, well, the LAPD. Laws exist to enforce an agenda. Sometimes we pretty universally agree on a law in principle, like murder being illegal, But most of the law is much messier than that, even in principle, let alone in practice. Even murder gets more complicated in practice as people fight over what's really murder and what's self-defense in some cases. Not to mention enforcement. Look how aggressively the police mobilized across the country to hunt down a suspect to frame for United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson's killing. And then compare that to the many instances of cops barely lifting a finger to find murder suspects or missing folks when they're just regular people, especially if they're marginalized folks. Hell, the JonBenet Ramsey murder case was a major national story, and the cops actively tried to frame the family for her murder in the media because they botched the investigation and they were trying to cover their own tracks. What does it say when even the most universally agreeable laws in our system are this tied up in politics when it comes to enforcement? Drug laws and loitering laws show enforcement for what it really is. We have a system that allows cops to pick and choose when and where to enforce the law, and in every part of the country there's a different local marginalized group that they like to pick on. Here in the hollers of southern Appalachia, it's migrant workers and poor folks on the receiving end of this abusive over-policing. In cities like Atlanta and Memphis, it's black folks. In Oklahoma, it's indigenous folks. In Arizona, it's Latino folks. There is absolutely no equality in enforcement of the law in this country. The cops are free to pick and choose when to apply the law, whether that's to search for drugs or to crack down on protests. And everywhere, those with enough money are basically immune from any consequences of breaking the law, even if they're caught red-handed. This means that the whole notion of law enforcement being apolitical or above partisan politics is a lie and a delusion. If you don't instill political values into law enforcement, they'll instill their politics on you. You're just leaving it up to whoever signs up for that badge and gun to decide what the spirit of the law is, when it needs application, and when you can let something slide. And the result is us having some of the most systematically oppressive law enforcement apparatuses on earth, like the LAPD. But I don't want to get too lost in the general problems of policing here, because these issues exist in red and blue cities and in red and blue states. I specifically want to highlight the lack of self-awareness of blue cities and states for employing the exact same kind of cops as red cities and states. They're all members of the exact same police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, and they all share the exact same us versus the citizenry, protect and serve ourselves at your expense mentality. But I don't see any daylight between Brian Kemp or previous Georgia governors and the Georgia State Patrol, Atlanta PD, Cobb County PD, or Gilmer County PD. For example, about 10 years ago, I was at the state capitol in Atlanta to film an act of civil disobedience. About 20 protesters from a group called Moral Mondays, consisting mostly of local faith groups, were trying to push then Governor Nathan Deal on expanding Medicaid in the state as part of the Affordable Care Act. They carried signs and stood in one of the main staircases of the Capitol, which was a calculated and planned way of breaking the law, by blocking a staircase and creating a fire hazard in a public building, or something to that effect. Their goal was to get arrested to bring attention and press coverage to the issue of Medicaid expansion. And Georgia State Patrol and the Capitol Police had a heads up and were waiting there with plenty of force and zip ties to arrest everyone participating in that act. Now imagine for a second that these cops had decided that they actually wanted Medicaid to be expanded, that they agreed with the protesters and in spite of their law breaking refused to take any action, pushing the buck to the governor and the legislature to pass Medicaid expansion now or risk emboldened protests in the face of passive cops. What would Nathan Deal have done? Just said, "Oh, I guess the cops tell me what to do now. Bring me my pen, I will sign Medicaid expansion into law at once." No, the first thing he would have done would have been to fire the officers in command, and probably charge them with obstruction. And if that backfired and created a department-wide rebellion or something, he would have liquidated the entire Georgia State Patrol and started over. It's safe to say someone like Deal or Kemp would probably take their chances firing the entire department, even if that meant they had to deputize militias ideologically aligned with them, like the Oath Keepers or Three Percenters or Proud Boys, as law enforcement and security. Anything rather than just let rogue cops limit and direct the way they use their sovereign power. They know that's where their power comes from. If the guns they pay for aren't on their side, then they don't have any power. And as wretched as I think them and their ideas are, their successes politically as a movement boil down to the fact that conservatives understand power on some level, and liberals do not on any level. Which takes me back to LA. That hypothetical I just described is exactly what has happened in Los Angeles over the past few weeks. California Governor Newsom, LA Mayor Bass, and LA Police Chief McDonnell have all criticized and condemned the Trump regime's actions, especially the targets of the ICE raids that kicked off this wave of uprisings. Chief McDonnell said the feds were intentionally escalating a volatile situation, and they are, but he ignores the fact that his own employees couldn't wait to get out into the streets to shoot rubber bullets at journalists and to kettle, beat, and tear gas protesters. The LAPD has been gleefully attacking their own citizens and the people whose taxes pay the LAPD's salaries and buys all their tools. And what was the response from the Democrats in power in California towards these flagrant escalations of violence from people they employ? They don't even really seem to notice that instead of having disciplined guns under their command, they actually just employ a rogue MAGA paramilitary force that couldn't wait to turn on them. Most of the LAPD would probably gladly hogtie Newsom and Bass and deliver them to Trump if that's what he asked. That's what I mean about political illiteracy. Their concept of what power is and where it comes from is so detached from reality that they don't even comprehend their own vulnerability and lack of armed force in the middle of a literal constitutional crisis. Newsom was egging on Tom Homan to arrest him as though he's under the impression he would have some other card in his hand to play if he did. You don't, Gavin. Take a look around you, dude. Every gun you see is in service to Trump at the end of the day. You employ and train and arm your alleged enemies while disarming your own people and letting the enemy oppress them. And I say alleged because it's impossible to rule out at least some of the Dems being essentially MAGA sleeper agents when you're talking about this level of apparent miscalculation. I've been giving them the benefit of the doubt so far in this show that their brains are just rat poisoned by their own delusion, but let's be honest, some of them must be complicit and want exactly what Trump is doing. If they were all just delusional, then the Democratic Party wouldn't even be capable of putting a fundraiser together, which is the only thing they're actually good at as a party. Some of them are definitely just straight up snakes and liars. So this message isn't for them because I don't know who's a rat and who ain't, so at this point, I've just stopped trusting any of them to do anything. This is a message to the average Democratic voter who has likely been swayed by these delusional ideas about power being pushed by their leaders and their talking heads, and maybe above all by the show The West Wing. Here's an example of what I mean. As all this was going on in LA, liberal commentator and author Ezra Klein got into a Twitter spat about some of his views on power, and I think this quote really highlights why Newsom and Bass and the California Dems are getting stomped into the ground right now, not just by Trump, but by their own cops. Power will be ill-used by your friends as well as your enemies, by your political opponents as well as your neighbors. From this perspective, there are no safe reservoirs of power. Corporations sometimes serve the national interest and sometimes betray it. Unions sometimes serve the national interest and sometimes betray it. A lot is lost when you collapse the complex interests of politics into a simple morality play. Power bad. This is the kind of analysis that you maybe do with college students learning about politics in depth for the first time, so that they can consider the system as a whole and the implications of power. Maybe. But this is not a conversation you have while a fascist regime is trying to consolidate power. At that point, you have no choice but to grab power wherever you can muster it, or you will be swallowed whole by the machine. Because they're not considering any of the implications of power or its pitfalls. They want to do the horrible things they're trying to do, and they'll wield power however they feel like to achieve those ends. If someone is reciting Lord Acton's axiom at you right now as a part of their pitch for their political movement, that's not a political movement, that's a suicide pact. And Gavin Newsom and co are chugging that Kool-Aid like there ain't gonna be enough to go around. Texas has about as much sovereignty as any U.S. state can have because their leaders have consolidated all the power in the state in their own hands. And California has just about the least sovereignty of any U.S. state because their massive, criminal, terroristic local and state police forces are in practice the agents of outside forces, of the MAGA movement and of Donald Trump. State governments are not bound by law to commit their own resources to federal law enforcement. They can be asked for assistance, and they can be punished for obstructing federal law enforcement, but it is unconstitutional for the federal government to force local cops to perform seizures, searches, security, riot control, or any other act if local government didn't sign off on it first. All the feds can do is escalate federal law enforcement presence, send in the military in some capacity, or tie compliance to funding. So all those videos of LAPD cops on horseback wailing on unarmed protesters with billy clubs, that's either by the order of Chief McDonnell, Mayor Bass, and Governor Newsom, or those cops are rogue and lawless and McDonnell, Bass, and Newsom are just letting them run roughshod over them. And if you're not familiar with the history of the LAPD and the LA County Sheriff's Department in particular, you should know that this never really would have needed to be an explicitly partisan thing to do a deep purge of these departments, if not abolishing them altogether and starting again from scratch. The LAPD's history of racist terrorism is second only maybe to the Chicago PD among major American police departments. You've almost certainly heard of the vicious beating the LAPD gave Rodney King in 1992, but it goes way deeper than that. The other LAPD story you're most likely to be familiar with is the O.J. Simpson trial. At this point, there aren't a lot of people still holding out on the opinion that O.J. was framed. He wrote a book in the late 2000s and basically came just this side of admitting to the murders of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman. But he was able to beat the rap in court for two reasons. One is that thing we talked about earlier, how if you have enough money, the law is no insurmountable thing. But I don't think money alone would have gotten O.J. off with the amount of evidence that there was linking him to the murders. It was the LAPD's history of racist violence, terrorism, and especially their routine planting of evidence that gave O.J.'s legal team an opportunity to beat the charges. The mostly black downtown LA jury selected for the trial knew the stories and had their own lived experiences dealing with these treacherous cops. So the revelation that neo-Nazi detective Mark Furman was the first officer to put hands on key evidence blew the city's case to shreds in spite of how overwhelming that evidence was. Most of the jury was not compelled by any of the evidence in light of the Furman tapes being released, in which the detective can be heard talking about beating and framing black people for crimes. And I can't really blame him. Simpson went on to lose the same case in civil court, where the evidentiary standard is lower, and spent the rest of his life pretty much broke from the settlements that case imposed on him. It would not have taken the public much to be convinced that something needed to be done about the LAPD by the mid-90s at the latest. And the LA County Sheriff's Department is known for being the most gang-infested cop unit in the entire country. And police gangs are widespread throughout the country, so that's saying something. These gangs initiate members by having them commit acts of racial terrorism against the citizens of LA to prove their loyalty to their new gang. They traffic people and drugs, they plant evidence to blackmail and extort innocent people, and they exploit their power to commit heinous acts of sexual violence against people in custody, especially in jails where they're basically in complete control. Search the web for LASD gangs or Linwood Vikings, and you'll see the atrocities that this department regularly commits and has been committing for decades. If anyone in California politics, and especially the Democrats who love nothing more than kneeling in a kente cloth and saying Black Lives Matter, had ever had the stomach, they would have had every right and legal pretext to completely liquidate all the cops from these two rogue criminal organizations. Instead, their budgets go up every year, and investigation after investigation into corruption and extortion and brutality either yield nothing or only manage to turn up crimes too old to do anything about. It's either a complete and abject failure by the city and the state to hold those monsters accountable because they refuse to use their powers to do something about it, or it shows the depth of complicity that the Democrats have with these gangs. And the consequences are before your eyes now. California is first in line to face the encroachment of this fascist regime in full force. And what do they have for civil defense? Nothing. Well, no, not nothing. They have the solidarity being shown between Angelenos standing up for themselves and their community. But every badge and gun in the state are wielded by gangs who are traitors to their people. Billions and billions of taxpayer dollars have been poured into the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department. And many of those dollars come from the sales taxes and property taxes of the city and state's poorest residents in East LA and Compton and Inglewood. including many immigrants who don't even get the full benefits of paying taxes. They've put money into a coffer for years, and it's being used now to pay the LAPD gang members overtime while they attack the crowds trying to stop ICE from extrajudicially snatching people off the street. Imagine if that money had been spent on community development that made everyone more economically secure, making the community safer as a result. Imagine if that money had been used to build up civil defense forces, training and arming the community and enabling them to maintain the peace for themselves, instead of having an unjust order imposed on them by an outside group that's no better than a drug cartel. Most metro police departments in the US hire mostly from the surrounding suburbs instead of the neighborhoods they patrol. So what if we handed that power to the people who do actually live there? Things would look a lot different on the ground right now. Instead of chaotic and unstable resistance, the community would already be tooled up and organized to defend themselves from outside fascist encroachment. And then Newsom really could still pull the arrest me bro gimmick that he's trying on ICE Director Homan, and might actually have the material strength to back that up. Instead, the Democratic leadership in California stole their people's money and used it to build up an occupying army that the national fascist movement could stick their tentacles in and start operating like a muppet whenever they felt like, and now that day has come. So if you're in one of these failed cities or states without any local sovereignty, open to subjugation by cops who take their orders directly from Trump and not your local elected officials, I think you know what to do. Ban police unions, specifically the Fraternal Order of Police, and expel every cop who was an active member and never let them gain a foothold again. Replace militarized, cliquish police departments that protect each other for their abuses of power with civil defense forces. Regular people armed and trained in conflict resolution, de-escalation, and security who can do the things that cops are supposed to do but usually don't. And throw these West Wing brain Democratic leaders out and form new local parties tied directly to the membership of those civil defense forces. I don't know of any other political party on this planet whose grasp on the concept of power is this poor, with the exception of other liberal parties who have the same kind of brainworms as the Democrats. Do you believe what you say? Because if not, you have no place trying to lead us. And what good is believing something in theory if you won't make the tough, often confrontational choices to get those things done? It turns into pretzel logic fast. Democrats love to make excuses for not being bold because they don't have enough of a mandate, or they're trying to work with some of their members in more vulnerable districts, or they're trying to achieve bipartisanship. And by putting all these extra obstacles in their own way, they're guaranteed to piss their voters off and face an electoral backlash. And by the time they're back in power, they're right back to playing it safe instead of pushing the agenda they were elected to enact as aggressively as they can. And it's easy to get confused by that cycle when you look at the national political scene, but zoom in on California, or LA specifically, and you can see the Democrats operating with very few partisan constraints. And they have the same skittish approach there as they do at the national level. In spite of a 3-to-1 ratio majority in the state Senate and the state House, plus the governorship and most of the major cities' mayors. Republicans can't touch the Democratic agenda in California if the Democrats are committed to getting something done. Even less so in Los Angeles, the city council of which does not even have a Republican on it. The LAPD gets more than $2 billion a year of their taxpayers' money. And if your blood isn't already boiling, guess when Mayor Bass signed the latest city budget, locking in the LAPD's budget and raising the hiring levels for the department so they can bring on an estimated 240 soon-to-be gang members. Friday, June 6th. She announced it at the same time as the LAPD was in the streets tear-gassing and clubbing her constituents for protesting. It wasn't on her radar that Friday when she signed the budget, and you can go ahead and bank on them getting even more money next year. What's got me so pressed on this is that California might be the only state in the country that could really deal lasting political damage to the Trump administration. California by itself would be the 4th largest economy on Earth. A general strike in California alone would lay the entire US economy low. It could effectively turn the internet off and shut down some of the country's busiest ports. We need California to have their head in the game right now. But instead, they're governed by some combination of incompetent, confused idealists, more scared of their own potential to abuse power than they are afraid of having power abused against them, and MAGA sleeper agents in blue. We don't have time for the navel-gazing power version of Ezra Klein and people like him. We are facing the most totalizing threat to freedom and dignity in this country in decades. There is no point in trying to separate the wheat from the chaff at this point, and no time to do it anyway. Throw them all in the bin and start over.
This has been a presentation of New LJ Television. Visit us online at newlj.tv